Welcome to November in Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. In the US, November is when we celebrate Thanksgiving, and so I want to tell you, I am thankful for you. I am so thankful for our guests who are joining us this month. We have some wonderful conversations ahead for you. And as it's Remembrance Day and Veterans Day in the US, I do want to express my appreciation for the brave women and men who have fought and continue to fight for our freedoms. Now, enjoy learning all about history and the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am here. I'm so excited to be here with a wonderful author and podcaster and colleague. I'm just so excited. She's doing so many things. Sharon Bennett Connolly is joining us. She has a number of books. We are going to particularly look at some of the heroines in the Tudor world. So, Sharon, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me, Caroline. It's always lovely to chat with you.
Well, it is just a treat for me because you always have such exciting stories about, especially these women in history. And I just want to jump right into that idea because an earlier book of yours is Heroines of the Medieval World.
Yeah.
And now we're looking at Heroines of the Tudor world. And I love that you call them heroines. So tell us about that decision, how they are heroines.
Well, every woman is a heroine. Yeah. Basically.
Yeah, I love that.
They are women who, most women who make, especially in medieval times, most women who make leave a footprint on history have been unfairly criticized, shall we say. They tend to be maligned. I mean, there's that old saying, isn't there? Good girls don't make history. And
right.
So I wanted to change it and to change the focus so that it was on the women and to say that every single one of them is a heroine. And the perception of the bad girl, the she-wolf, the haughty empress is a misogynistic perception of these women. These were, women who are described as awkward and things like that. And it's not, it's that they're strong women who have their own views, who fight for their rights in a world that is not aimed at giving women rights. So they're all heroines, because if it wasn't for what these women did in medieval times and in the Tudor times, we wouldn't have the rights we have today. You and I wouldn't be allowed to talk on Zoom without somebody looking over our shoulder. There were women who were not allowed to read the Bible aloud in public in Tudor times. We can do that now. And they're my heroines, because thanks to them, I can do what I can do. I can stand on a stage and talk about them. So that's why I chose to call them heroines. And whatever they did, they fought for what they wanted, or for what they got. So they deserve recognition.
I love that. And that is a wonderful way to think of them, because we know different amounts about different women from these earlier periods of time.
Yeah.
But they are often maligned by the men who were writing about them at the time.
Yes.
And
it's only in the later Tudor period that we finally get women writing diaries and leaving memoirs and letters so that we get to hear their voices. Until that time, we've got, in Heroines of the Medieval World, I think I managed to find 4 women who gave us their voices. But one, Christine de Pizan, was amazing. And she actually wrote about women in history. But she also wrote biographies of kings and things. She was writing to a male audience. So she couldn't use her own voice totally. And same with Hildegard of Bingen. So it's only when and even when you get into the Tudor times and women are writing their memoirs, some of them, they still have to follow certain conventions so that they're not criticised or brought up on heresy charges and things like that. So you get to hear their voices, but there's still constraints on them.
Yes. And the fact that they are willing to take the chances and to do the work they do, whatever it is. And you're right. I love the broader definition of heroine, doing what they feel in whatever way called to do or they want to do, or their voices
Yep,
is heroic. And we need to
it
think
is.
of them that way. I love that. So I'd like to ask you about how you selected, and particularly for the Tudor women, there are a lot of fairly famous Tudor women that we know pretty well, and some less famous Tudor women. So how did you select? I mean, I talked to Melita a little while ago, and she's got 1,000 Tudor people. So she does a big look, right? Which I love. And now this is a smaller look, deeper into. So how do you choose which women to include?
Well, I deliberately, my first concern was to not let the six wives take over. Because with any Tudor book, it tends to be, okay, you've got Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and the other four, and then who? So it was like, I don't want the six wives to take over. So the six wives, they're all in there, but not in their own stories. So Anne Boleyn is in her sister Mary Boleyn's story, and Catherine Howard is in Jane Boleyn's story. So that was the first thing, to have the six wives, but put them in other people's stories and show them so that so that they don't take over, basically. I mean, you have to have Elizabeth I and Mary I and Jane Grey. So there were some women that you couldn't not have in there. But there were others that I found by accident. Like there's this, when we were talking about diarists, there's this Yorkshire woman called Margaret Hobie who wrote her own diary, and it's published, and I got a copy, and it's like, oh, I've got to include this woman, and I hadn't even heard of her until I started writing the book. And there's some, like, I'm a big Alexandre Dumas fan, and he wrote a fabulous book called La Reine Margot about Marguerite of Navarre, the wife of Henry IV and the daughter of Catherine de' Medici. And it's like, she was definitely going in the book because she is one of those women who has been very much maligned by history. You know, she had an affair and she and Henry IV didn't have a great relationship. And it's like, and Alexandre Dumas didn't actually help when you, if you've ever read La Reine Margot, she was a bit of a girl, according to him. But she was an incredibly strong woman who survived an awful lot and actually protected Henry IV just after they got married during the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day. So it's people like her I wanted to include, but I wanted a wide range. And what I did, I had these 12 chapters that I had used for Heroines of the Medieval World. So there was the medieval ideal, there was warrior heroines, disinherited heroines. And I decided when I was writing the book, I actually proposed it to my publisher as a sequel to Heroines of the Medieval World. So I said, I want to keep the same chapters, just have Tudor women in it. And so that it sort of progresses from how women were treated in medieval times to how they were treated in Tudor times. And I was actually expecting to find a great difference, and there wasn't. You know, there was still a lot of the old medieval conventions in Tudor times. You had to obey your father, marriages were arranged, girls were supposed to be seen and not heard and things. But at the same time, women were coming to prominence and had much more influence on things like religion, where they were kept from religion in medieval times. They were told, you know, they were put in nunneries if they were going to join the church. But in Tudor times, because of the Reformation, they spoke out, and it's the women who come to the fore when you look at the Reformation, like Anne Askew, Margaret Clitheroe. These women, both sides, not just reformists, but the Catholics as well. And it was interesting to see the differences but also the similarities from the medieval to the Tudor period.
That is so interesting because there are some similarities and some differences, and
Mm,
times change like the Reformation. I mean, it's one thing when everyone has the same beliefs, so
yes.
to speak, in medieval times. And as you say, the women on both sides of the
Mm,
Reformation speaking out and taking chances like Margaret Clitheroe does. And
yes.
ask you, you see these women being willing to suffer for
Mm,
their beliefs and speak out anyway, knowing the danger. And that's
yeah.
quite extraordinary. So you mentioned that you came across Margaret sort of accidentally, the diarist. Tell
Mm.
us a little bit about how your research sort of introduces you to some of these unexpected people, how you come across these unexpected discoveries.
Well, Margaret Hobie was just somebody mentioned her in an article, and I thought, oh, there's a book. Somebody's written a diary. Let me find her. And there's others, like I went to the Royal Armouries in Leeds with my son just for a day at the museum. And they do these demonstrations of sword fighting, stories about the Battle of Hastings, stories about the Tudor jousting and things like that. And one of the reenactors was a woman. And I went up to her and said, but women didn't. She said, now there's this long Meg of Westminster who ran a tavern, was a sword fighter, and would get stuck in with everybody. And it was like, oh, great. She's going in the book. And
Yeah.
so it's things like I just found them from some of the most unusual places. But I also live near Lincolnshire. I live literally across the River Trent from Lincolnshire. So I was aware of people like Anne Askew, Catherine Parr's link to Gainsborough Old Hall with her first husband, and Catherine Willoughby has had a castle in Lincolnshire at Grimsthorpe Castle. So some of the women I'd always been aware of, and others like Long Meg I suddenly discovered, and it was like, okay, she's going in the book, and you know.
I love discovering someone on a day out with your son where you're
Yeah.
not really intending to do that kind of research, but these people are there waiting for you to discover
Mm.
them, I think. So,
Oh, yes. Because we also went to Sheffield Manor Lodge one day. It was a research trip because it's, linked to Bess of Hardwick
mhm.
and Mary Queen of Scots. So I dragged my son along. Doesn't take a lot of dragging. He comes with me. He did some of the preliminary research for the book anyway. So he was well into it. And we when we got there in the little lodge house, Bess of Hardwick was sat there in her
Oh,
all in her costume, and it was a quiet day. There weren't many people around, so the three of us sat there for an hour talking.
wow.
It's
That's
like I'm
wonderful.
sat there thinking I'm chatting with Bess of Hardwick. And we were talking about Mary Queen of Scots, about Cardinal Wolsey, and he was just like, he sat there going, she's a reenactor, but she knew her stuff. And it was just nice to discuss with her the practicalities of being a Tudor. So it just gave
Yeah.
me a little insight into her ideas of Bess of Hardwick as well as my ideas of Bess of Hardwick.
Oh, that's great. And to think of Bess of Hardwick, who's sort of this icon in some ways,
Yes.
as a woman sitting here having a talk with somebody. That's a nice way to
Yeah.
think of Bess of Hardwick. I don't usually think of her that way. So,
Yeah. And I would love to just sit and have a talk with Bess of Hardwick. And this is the closest I was going to get to doing it. So.
well, that's wonderful. So, I want to ask just a little bit, and I know that yes, we do have well-behaved women sometimes making history, but there are also some scandals at the time, and you
Mm,
do talk a little bit about the scandals. And I wonder if you could talk to us about how women are often, I mean, it almost seems a scandal if a woman wants to have an opinion in these
mm,
days or speak out at all.
Yeah.
So were women sort of scandalous because they're just being themselves? Or how are they treated by society in
Mm.
terms of their
Well,
reputation?
yeah, well, that's the thing. And it is very much, it's still in Tudor times a misogynistic view of their reputation. I mean, you have the great one I came across was Diane de Poitiers, who admitted she could have gone in Tudor mistresses as well as scandalous women. But she was just so fantastic. She was the lover of the mistress of Henry II of France. And Henry II was married to Catherine de' Medici shortly after he started his relationship with Diane de Poitiers. And it was like, there was this, I really feel for Catherine de' Medici. You know, she's portrayed as the Serpent Queen and poisoning her enemies and things like that. And it's like, you look at the marriage she had, and that poor woman had to play second fiddle to her mistress. Henry was much happier being with Diane de Poitiers than Catherine de' Medici. And it got to such an issue that Diane de Poitiers used to get him warmed up and then send him to have sex with his wife because he couldn't do it without. And it's like, and yeah, Catherine de Medici, they put a hole in the floor, and Catherine de Medici would look from through this hole down to the bedroom below to see
Oh.
how Henry and Diane did it and things like that. It was
Oh.
like, he's just, yeah, scandalous. And yet, because Henry II died before Catherine de' Medici, in rather a horrible way, he got shard of a lance through his eye and took a few days to die. But that meant that Catherine could finally have her revenge because she denied Diane access to Henry's deathbed. And then once Henry was dead, her son was 10 years old, the son who would be king. So she was, no, sorry, he was 16, it was Francis. But she became the most powerful woman in France. And so she could deny Diane de Poitiers access to everywhere. She basically had to leave court. But she wasn't vindictive. She didn't insist on everything being returned and making Diana pauper. She allowed her to leave court, to live in her own residences. There was one castle that she wanted that she demanded back. But everything else, she was just left to it. She didn't have to be, she was magnanimous, which is, you know, when you hear about the way the movies portray Catherine de Medici, it's like, no, she was a vindictive, vicious, but she wasn't, not with Diane de Poitiers. And she could have been.
She could have been, yeah. She could
Yeah,
have gotten her own back after all those years
yeah.
of being second. Yeah.
And then you have the other scandals like Anne Boleyn and Mary Boleyn. When I looked into Mary Boleyn, you read all these books where Mary and Henry VIII had an affair for however many years. Some of them say 6 years. Some of them, all we know is there was one phrase that Henry VIII used that somebody said, "Oh, you slept with Anne's mother and her sister," and Henry said, "Never the mother." So that's how we know about this relationship with Mary Boleyn. But that's the extent of what we know about the relationship with Mary Boleyn. And as a result, everybody's gone on and said it was for years. It could have been a one night stand for all we know. But it's defined the way we look at Mary Boleyn.
Yeah. Yeah, and she tends to get some pretty nasty nicknames as
Mm,
a result of what might have happened that we don't know.
no, exactly. So it's just like it's trying to set the record a little straighter, I think, and just make people aware of how things have been embellished over the years and what information we have and don't have.
Right. And when you strip it back to the actual information, it's often a different story.
Yes.
All right. So that's a little bit on the scandals. And I appreciate that because a lot of times these women were just being themselves and painted in scandalous ways rather
Yeah.
than, you know,
And forced into it as well, you know, because a lot of women, their fathers, their mother, you know, there are a lot of people say about Anne Boleyn and Mary Boleyn, it was the family wanting influence and power. We don't know what extent that was, but family, a lot of it was about family. And a lot of it was like with Bsky Blount and Henry VIII as the mistresses. If they were mistresses, then they were looked after afterwards. You know, once Henry had finished with them,
Mm-hmm.
he did arrange marriages for them or gave them money and facilities. Henry VIII and Bsky Blount were on good terms for the rest of their lives. You know, he used to send
Right.
her Christmas presents and she'd send him Christmas presents.
Oh, so
They
that's nice.
stayed friends. But he never
And
sent anything to her husband.
hmm. Well, that is nice to think about. And as you say, there weren't a lot of options in some cases for some of these
No.
women. So let's think about using that sort of as a background idea. Let's think about the laws of inheritance. And you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned that the laws did restrict what many of the women could and couldn't do in terms of inheriting from family or having access to their own money or
Mm.
land or whatever. We've talked a little bit about Bess of Hardwick. We can talk about her. She tends to be an exception. She did very well. But
Yes.
what about the laws of inheritance and how does that affect some of the women during the
Mm.
Tudor times?
Well, in those days, as same as medieval times, land was important and inheritance was important. And to protect it, everything went through the male line so that it stayed in male hands. And it was only when there were no boys to inherit, the daughters got them. And the problem with that stemmed from medieval times was if land was passed to the eldest son, it stayed whole. If there was no son and you had 2 or 3 daughters, then the land was split equally between the daughters, which was why you needed a son, you know, to have pass everything on whole. Otherwise, patrimony gets separated and is smaller as a result, so you're less powerful at court. Land was still the basis of power. The more land you had, the richer you were, and the more influential at court you were. So yeah, it was very important. And disinheriting heroines. Well, you look at Henry VIII. He disinherited both his daughters, Mary the First and Elizabeth. He had them declared illegitimate. He took them out of the line of succession. Then once he had a son, he put them back in the line of succession, but did not declare them legitimate. So Mary the First, one of the first things she did when she came to the throne was pass an act of parliament declaring herself legitimate. Elizabeth I, when she came to the throne, didn't. Even though that there was an act of parliament declaring her illegitimate, she didn't reverse it because she didn't want to. She knew how divisive her mother's legend was. And she didn't want to draw attention to the fact that she was Anne Boleyn's daughter and, you know, raise opposition as a result. She was very proud of being Anne Boleyn's daughter, but she was very aware of how divisive that was, especially after Mary had just been on the throne for 5 years and was Catherine of Aragon's daughter. So although she could have had herself declared legitimate, she just thought better to leave well alone. And I think she probably was right, because nowadays nobody even knows that she was actually technically illegitimate on the throne. So yeah, it was, inheritance was a hard one, but sometimes, I mean, especially in Tudor times, it wasn't just the women who were disinherited either. You know, entire families were kicked out of their homes if they disagreed with Henry VIII. And there's one, Elizabeth Fitzgerald, who is known as the Fair Geraldine in a poem, who is the daughter of the Irish Earl of Kildare. Her family were all disinherited. But it was actually as the fact that she was actually a a granddaughter or great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Woodville. So she was a distant cousin of Queen Elizabeth. So when Elizabeth was just a princess, she was actually placed in Elizabeth's household and they were raised together. So she was making these royal connections that would help her family regain their position later on. So it wasn't always, the one thing about medieval and Tudor times is just because you're disinherited, it doesn't have to stay that way.
Right. And I know one of the examples, and this affects women and men, is the children of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, who were
Yeah.
originally illegitimate and later made legitimate. So that went that way. And, Mary and Elizabeth, those two half sisters who both become queens, technically at the time couldn't inherit the title.
Yeah.
So it was a big deal, and it was a big deal at all levels of society. Like you say, land was so important and powerful.
Yeah, land
So,
was the basis of power.
right. So what did land represent to women? So in other words, if you're a young woman growing up, what are some ways available to you? I mean, do you make a good marriage? Do you try to make good marriage? Did you see some of these women hoping for the kind of marriage that would gain land and therefore influence and wealth for them and their family?
Yeah, that was the main thing. Their fathers would be looking for suitable marriages that would give them a position. You had people like Catherine Parr, who she married the eldest son of Sir Thomas Burgh of Gainsborough, Edward Burgh, as her first marriage. And I do think that, if poor Edward hadn't died after 4 years of marriage, Catherine's life would have been so different. But when Edward died, Catherine, because she didn't have any children with him, she had no interest in the borough patrimony. But she also had no money of her own, because girls were given a dowry, but then after that, everything went to their brothers. So she more or less arranged a second marriage herself, because she had to do something. She was basically out on her ear. And that was the problem for girls, especially families where there's a lot of girls and no sons.
Right.
The patrimony has to be split up and they have a dowry. But they want a better, if they can marry higher, they get a better career, a better position at court, more money to spend, basically, and stronger, the more higher up the social hierarchy you are, the better your position at court. And in fact, as with Elizabeth Fitzgerald, the position at court, the higher the position, you're less likely to have wages.
Oh,
Because it shows that you can afford to serve the Queen without actually being a burden on the Queen. So you're a lady in waiting without wages, so that because you're so rich.
so that's really a job for the wealthy who already
Yeah,
have the money and don't need it.
but girls are expected to marry well and to help their families.
Okay.
Once they're married, if they're married into a position where they're in a higher position, like Anne Boleyn, when she married Henry VIII, suddenly she had all these family members who needed positions at court. And same with Catherine Howard. And Catherine Parr surrounded herself with friends who she helped bring to court and arranged. And if girls were actually capable of getting into the royal household as maids of honor of one of the queens, their prospects for a marriage was going to be better, because the Queen would arrange the marriage. I mean, Catherine Willoughby's mum, Maria de Salinas, came over with Catherine of Aragon from Spain. And when she married William Willoughby de Eresby, it was Henry VIII paid for the wedding, gave them some money, and gave them Grimthorpe Castle as a wedding present. So being in the royal household gives you a better dowry.
Yes. Wow. Okay. So, and then their children, as a result, reap those rewards
Yeah,
as well.
exactly. I mean, the best one is to look at Bess of Hardwick. Like you say,
Yeah.
she married her first husband. The marriage only lasted about 18 months, but that gave her enough money to have a little independence. And then when she married her second husband, who was at court, it was like she got a position at court as well, which gave her more independence and more influence. And then when he died, that was Cavendish, I think, she married William de St. Lo, who had been Cavendish's friend, and helped her with some legal problems that Cavendish had had as he died. And so she was financially better off after Cavendish died because he'd left everything to her rather than to the children. And then the same with William St. Lo. They, unlike most Tudor couples, Bess, with all her husbands, made sure that everything was in joint names. She was a very astute businesswoman. So by the time she married her last husband, the Earl of Shrewsbury, she was financially independent and able to build castles wherever she wanted, like Hardwick Hall, and then decide she didn't like the old hall, so she built a new hall.
Right. Women like that seem to just have, I don't know, would you say it's just an innate sense of how to
Mm,
do that? Because that seemed to really, she did it over and over.
yeah,
She sort of married up and better every time,
yes.
which I'm
But
not
she
sure.
also managed to avoid pitfalls
Mm,
because she was actually aware of Catherine Grey's secret relationship with Edward Seymour. Now,
mm-hmm.
Catherine Grey was Jane Grey's younger sister and was in line to the throne. So Queen Elizabeth had been keeping her on a short reign, not allowing her to marry and things like that. So that she knew, basically, so she knew where her heirs were.
Mm-hmm.
But Catherine had other ideas. She secretly married Edward Seymour when Elizabeth was away on progress. And then she discovered she was pregnant.
Ah.
And she confessed it to Bess of Hardwick, asking Bess for advice. Unfortunately, she also told Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, who went running to the Queen straight away. But if the Queen had been so minded, she could have taken against Bess because Bess knew the secret and hadn't told her first. But luckily, they seem to have had a good relationship and Bess weathered the storm. Catherine Grey, of course, ended up in the Tower of London
Yeah.
in separate rooms to Sir Edward Seymour with the baby. Apparently, even then, she wasn't as closely guarded as she would have been because she got pregnant again.
Yeah, that's a pretty good story there. Somehow those separate rooms weren't separate enough, I guess.
Yeah. Heads will roll.
Hmm. And it was another son, so it was
Yeah.
just, exactly
Yeah.
what Elizabeth did not want.
No, and she ended up they were both declared illegitimate because the wedding
Hmm.
had been illegal because the sovereign hadn't approved it. So the two children were declared illegitimate. But it's a proper Game of Thrones, the Tudor era, isn't it?
Yes, yes. So, we've talked about women sort of at different levels of society, and some that don't have much land, or there are a number of children and they're trying to, make a marriage, these young women, and right up to Mary the First and Elizabeth the First and those closest to them. And in your book, like you said, and it's so interesting, you followed the chapters that were in Heroines of the Medieval World so that you could look at all these different examples of the
Mm,
way women live and their experiences. So I just imagine if you could pick just a couple of, and I know you've done so much more research than ends up in the book. So just sort of let your mind go. If you could pick a couple of women whose experiences or whose opportunities might surprise us when we think about the Tudor world. And I think a lot of us, have an idea of Henry VIII and Mary and Elizabeth and,
Mm.
sort of the way things were. But are there some of the women over this period of time whose experiences might surprise us, either things they were able or not able to do in this period of time?
Well, there are a couple who spring out. Anne Askew,
Mm.
um, because I just feel for the poor girl. She was her older sister was supposed to marry Thomas Kyme, a neighboring son of a neighboring lord, and she died. So Anne Askew was put in there as a substitute. She was a substitute bride. And of course, the relationship did not go well because he was Catholic and she was leaning towards the Protestant faith. And she was reading the Bible and deciding what was right for her. And Thomas Kyme didn't like the fact that she was drawing attention to the family and that she was basically a Protestant. And he kicked her out of the house. And she went to London seeking a divorce, probably thinking, well, Henry VIII just had one, so they'll let me have a divorce. And you just feel for this girl who she then gets in with with like-minded people. And she's an incredibly well-educated, incredibly intelligent woman and discusses religion with her friends and gets brought before the mayor of London to answer for the fact that she's talking, women weren't allowed to read the Bible aloud and women weren't supposed to discuss the Bible and discuss religion. And she ends up getting condemned to death. And then you have these two members of court, Richard Rich and Risley, it's pronounced Risley but spelled Ryathesley.
I always remember because I think he's pretty grisly. So Risley
Yeah,
seems
Grizzly Risley. Who then she's already condemned to death, and they torture her and rack her so that her limbs are dislocated to a great extent to try and get her to implicate Catherine Parr, the Queen at the time, into her heresy. The bravery of this woman, because she didn't implicate Catherine Parr. No one knows to this day whether Catherine Parr was involved. So it's like, how brave is that? She was 25. She was
I
still, she was so young and she went through so much. And she even had time to get her story written down before she was burnt to death. What we know is from her own words. She dictated her story, so we know the extent of her torture because she tells us about it.
and that was illegal at the time, wasn't it, to torture a woman?
It was illegal to torture anybody after they have been condemned to death.
Right.
So it was totally illegal just to torture anybody. Once you're condemned, they can't torture you. It's like,
Right.
well, no, but they can chop off your head or burn you to death, but they can't torture you.
Yeah. And
Well,
she
these
knew
two
she was
sadistic men.
and she knew she was facing that terrible death of being burned.
Yes.
I mean, that's worse than having your
Yeah.
head chopped off, as bad as that is.
And she had to be taken on the back of a cart strapped to a chair because she couldn't walk. Every movement of that cart all the way to Smithfield must have been torture in itself. Her last moments were just pure agony.
Right. And that kind of bravery, when you think about a heroine to be that brave
Yeah.
and dedicated to her beliefs and to keeping her counsel about Catherine Parr,
Yes.
it really is extraordinary.
Yeah, exactly. Just knowing that all she had to do was say, Catherine Parr, the Queen knew, and they would have stopped torturing her. But she wasn't going to either give her up or lie, whatever it was. She wasn't implicated because she also knew that this was Catherine Parr's fate if she actually said Catherine Parr was involved. So they were trying to bring down the Queen, and having already had two queens executed, you know what they were aiming for.
Well, and that's a really good reminder of how dangerous this time was
Mm,
for women right up to the top level. Because as you say,
yes.
they're going after the queen. He's already
Mm,
executed 2 wives,
yeah.
and that had never happened before.
No.
So the 3rd one is not gonna be all that hard for him.
Mm,
So, yes, this was a very, very dangerous time, and so for a woman to hold her own and speak her truth was a very dangerous thing, and Anne
yeah.
Askew, as you say, paid the ultimate price for that.
Mm,
So I think she should be a heroine to all of us. I mean, all
yes.
of them should, but she
Definitely.
in particular. So are there others besides Anne Askew who really captured your imagination or your heart that you really love?
Well, there is the pirate, of course, Grace
Yes.
O'Malley.
Okay, let's talk about Grace. I do love her.
Oh, she's brilliant because she was an only daughter, you know. She was inheriting everything from her father, and her father seems to have been very happy for her to inherit. Um, she'd been on ships since she was a child, and her father had a fleet of ships that they used for trade, sometimes piracy. You know, if a ship came too close and they fancied it, then they'd take it. But she came up against some of Elizabeth's officials in Ireland for the lands she ruled, and they imprisoned her sons and imprisoned her at one stage. But rather than accepting it or going home and sitting quietly, she actually appealed to Queen Elizabeth I, and they met in person. And
Mhm.
it's just the idea of this pirate queen meeting the Queen of England. And you can't help but think that Elizabeth would have really liked her, and the two of them did get on very well. But yeah, it's just people like that that just book the trend of what women
Yes.
are supposed to be like.
Yes, and I love that because not everyone who wants an audience with the queen gets one.
No,
And there certainly weren't a series of women Elizabeth was meeting with because there weren't women ambassadors and so for her to
no.
meet with Grace O'Malley was a huge deal. And
Yes, very
I
much so.
I do love that because it does seem, I mean, Elizabeth did agree to some things and seems to
Mm,
have they seem to be kindred spirits in a little bit of a way somehow.
yes, I think they were both very much alike. They saw same qualities in each other.
And
So yeah, I loved that story. I loved writing Grace and Mally's story. And
yeah.
the other one I find interesting is Caterina Sforza,
Mm.
who was an Italian countess who fell foul of Cesare Borgia. He wanted her castle. And there'd been fighting going on for a while, and Caterina Sforza, he managed to get hold of her children. Cesare Borgia had her children, and he threatened to execute them. And in something very reminiscent of John Marshall in the 12th century, apparently, she lifted her skirts and said, "It's okay, I can make more."
Whoa.
And if you remember, in John Marshall, the father of William Marshall,
Hmm.
when Stephen threatened to execute William Marshall, who was only a 6-year-old boy at the time, John Marshall said, "It's okay, I've got the hammers and anvils to make more." So I think Caterina Sforza was channeling John Marshall.
That and showing that she could make more.
Yeah.
Yes. See, that's what you love about these women because that's so unexpected.
Mm, yeah. It's these women who they they've always been put down in life, always forced to take second stage to the men. But when you look at them through their own lens, it's like they stand out. They're remarkable. They're incredible. I used to think when I was a teenager, I wasn't interested in women's history. This is a very recent thing for me. It's the last 10, 15 years I've been looking into women's history, because before that, I thought all they did was sit at home and sew and raise children. It's like there was so much more to them. Not just, yes, we know about Elizabeth I, but there were so many more women
Hmm.
out there at the time making a name for themselves and making history. But because they
Yes.
were women, they're not always noticed.
Right. And that's one of the things I truly love about the work you do and these two heroine books that really are great companion pieces,
Thank you.
the medieval world and the Tudor world, because yes, there are women that we know and know fairly well, Elizabeth and Mary, and but there are also these other women whose
Mm,
stories are so important because they were making history. And I
yes.
think of someone like Anne Askew and the decisions she made and the strength she showed changed
Mm,
things.
yes.
She reshaped things. And I just love hearing about that and these other people that you found and that you got to share with us. So,
Mm.
first I want to thank you. Thank you for coming on and sharing what went into this marvelous book. And I'd also like to ask, because I know you have been doing a lot of speaking and a lot of travel and doing some fun things lately. So, what are you working on now? And kind of what's going on for you right now?
Well, I'm technically working on two books at the minute because I am editing one and writing the next one. So
Okay.
I'm editing what a book I'm very proud of actually because I keep reading it now and I'm like thinking, oh, that really reads really well. And that's Scotland's Medieval Queens
Great. Yep.
from St. Margaret to Margaret of Denmark. And I have really loved working on this because there is so little out there about Scotland's queens. And it's all my son's fault. He came home from an English lit lesson one day, having done Macbeth. And he said, Mum, there's a society putting the story right about Richard III. You need to do something about Lady Macbeth. She wasn't that horrible.
Ah, okay. Good for
So
him.
the prologue of the book is a chapter on Lady Macbeth.
Oh,
And then
excellent.
I go into the rest of the medieval queens because I'm like, oh, Lewis, now there's an idea. I don't think there's enough for a book on Lady Macbeth. Well, Scotland's medieval queens. So
That's
Scotland's medieval
wonderful.
queens was born.
That's wonderful. I love the way he is involved in you thinking of these ideas too. That's
Oh, he
great.
has got a very good mind, history mind. He loves it. It's brilliant having somebody to a companion to go around
Wonderful.
historical sites with. And discussing all aspects of history with him. He comes up with some great stuff to talk about.
Oh, that's
And my
great.
next book after that, what I'm halfway through writing, is The Medieval Princess, from the Norman Conquest
Oh,
to the
okay.
Wars of the Roses. So
Okay.
all the English princesses, from the daughters of William the Conqueror to the daughters of Edward the Fourth.
Oh, wow. That's a bigger sweep. I mean, there are going to be a lot of young women in that sweep. That's
There
wonderful.
are, and I've decided also to include Henry I's illegitimate daughters,
Oh,
mainly because I
okay.
want to write about Juliana, the one who tried to kill him.
Well, that's a story that we don't hear very much. So I think that's good. But there were quite a few of those illegitimate daughters, weren't there,
There
with Henry
were,
the First?
yes, there were. So I decided I didn't treat, because of course there's also Joan, Lady of Wales, John's illegitimate daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
decided I'd include the illegitimate princesses as well.
Oh,
But
that's good.
that's, I mean, there is a series of books, I think they're in 6 volumes, from Victorian times, Mary Everett Green's The Lives of the Princesses of England. But there's no modern take on it. So this
Okay.
is basically a fresh look at them.
Oh, that's great because I mean, bless the Victorians' hearts, they did their job then, but we do need a fresh take at a
Yeah,
lot of
that's the
these.
thing. We need to do it through our lens rather than
Yes.
theirs because they had certain attitudes about what women should do,
Right.
and that would colour the way they wrote about women.
Yes.
So now we have a much more open attitude about women, what women should do.
Right,
So,
right. And can see those lives in a sort of brighter way
yes,
and not leave out the bits that, they left out because they didn't sort of line up with Victorian ideals.
yes,
Oh,
exactly.
that
So
is great, Sharon. I can't wait for both of those.
thank you.
This will be great. And we'll have lots to talk about again. So
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, I always love talking to you. I learn so much and I get so much to get excited about. I just need to find an extra day in the week to read more so I could just lose myself.
Thank you.
But
I
thank
get
you.
I was at the Lincoln Book Festival on Sunday.
Yes.
I know you saw that I had it was my first time with my own dressing room. They
That
actually
was
had
so
there was a
exciting.
sign on the door saying dressing room Sharon Bennett Connolly, and I'm like, oh wow, that's my first dressing room. Didn't use it. So I'm
Doesn't
like, what do I need
matter.
a dressing room for? I'm dressed. I
That
went and
is
sat in the cafe and had a coffee and went, I've got my own dressing room.
that is wonderful. Well, I guess that lets you know you have really
Yeah,
arrived. And I
definitely.
hope there was a big star on the dressing room because,
No, there wasn't a star, but my husband's done me one since and put it on my door.
okay, good, because you deserve it. So, star treatment for you, Sharon.
But,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Thank
But
you
everybody I
so
spoke
much.
to said how enthusiastic the talk was and enjoyed it. And I got to talk about Nicholaa de la Haye, who's my
Yes.
all-time favorite heroine, the lady who defended Lincoln Castle. And I got to
Yes.
talk about, I did a talk on basically Lincolnshire's history heroines. So I did some medieval and some Tudor. So Catherine Swynford got in there.
Oh,
Anne
good.
Askew, Catherine Parr, Catherine Willoughby. So it was really, really nice to talk about Lincolnshire women in Lincolnshire.
Oh, that sounds perfect. I love that. And I love that you get to talk about your favorite heroine, Nicholaa, because she really, again, she changed things. You
She
see
did.
these women who really changed history
Mm,
and we don't know enough about them.
no,
So
exactly.
this is great. Well, congratulations on that. Congratulations
Thank
on
you.
having your own dressing room at that event. And
Right.
yeah, that is just really exciting. And I'm glad your husband made you a star for your door because that's very appropriate. And thank you for being here with us to talk about Lincolnshire women just a little bit. We'll have to hear more about that, but also these heroines, truly heroines
Yes.
of Tudor history, a little bit of the medieval world as well. But these women who absolutely changed history and
Mm.
bringing them to light. It's so wonderful the work you're doing. I'm so excited. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for asking me. And like I say, they should be called heroines because they inspire us.
That's
And
right.
if they can inspire women to think more about themselves and to be more than just somebody's wife, daughter, or sister,
Yeah.
as they were in medieval times, so much the better. But they're such inspiring stories.
They are, and they're speaking their own truth, and that can show us how to speak ours as
Yes,
well. And
exactly.
I love what they can teach us. And
Mm,
I love that. I feel inspired when I read your books about these women through history because they played the cards they were dealt to the
yeah,
highest. And they are heroines. And I'm
yeah,
so glad you
definitely.
call them that. And I hope we
Thank
all
you.
do. From now on, we all need to call them heroines because now we know they are. So thank you, Nicholaa. Thank you, Sharon, for bringing us Nicholaa's and all the other stories of women because they're so wonderful and so inspiring.
Mm, thank
And
you.
thank you, everyone, for joining us and listening to these great stories of women and what they teach us and how they show us what's possible in our lives. History really does show us what's possible. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. And Sharon, we'll have you back again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. We are trying to expand our reach a little bit and share the joy of listening to history. So please take a minute to give us a rating, maybe share with a friend. We really appreciate it. And join us again soon to see how history shows us what's possible. Thank you.